Welcome all to the Arthur B. and David B. Jacobson Lecture on Antisemitism for 2025. It's my very great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Paul Binski of the University of Cambridge. Paul is Emeritus Professor of the History of Art. He is a Fellow of the British Academy and a corresponding Fellow of the Medieval Academy of America, and was Slade Professor at Oxford University in 2006 to 2007. A leading international authority on Gothic art and architecture and medieval culture more widely, his range of nearly 200 publications include the book Westminster Abbey and the Plantagenets from 1995, which won the 1995 Longman's History Prize, Beckett's Crown, Art and Imagination in Gothic England, 1170 to 1300 from 2004, the winner of the 2006 Historians of British Art Prize, Gothic Wonder, Art, Artifice, and the Decorated Style, 1290 to 1350 from 2014, which also won the 2016 Historians of British Art Book Award. He published Gothic Sculpture in 2019 and Architecture and Affect in the Middle Ages in 2024. He now writes widely on general issues of aesthetics, rhetoric, and the visual arts in the Middle Ages, and is also a guest curator at the National Gallery in London. The title of his lecture tonight is From Blood Libel to Expulsion: Images, Anti-Semitism, and Material Culture in Medieval England. Please join me in welcoming Paul Binski to Brown.
Thank you very much, Saul, for that very warm introduction and for extending me the honor of speaking to you this evening. Sometime around the year 1240, the famous English monk and chronicler Matthew Paris was working on what he called his Greater Chronicle, the largest English medieval chronicle ever written, and one of the first medieval chronicles ever to be printed. Matthew, a versatile man working at St. Albans Abbey, not far from London, put little illustrations in the borders of his text. Very few, if any, medieval chroniclers illustrated their works in this way. From a visitor to his abbey at a kind of crossroads, not far from London, he had recently learnt of the story of the Wandering Jew, a tale with profound moral implications. The tale of a man in Jerusalem who, encountering Christ carrying the cross to Calvary, told him to walk faster. Christ replied, "I'm going, but you shall walk until I come again." The story first appears in a Bolognese chronicle in the year 1223. It entered the Great St. Albans Chronicle under the year 1228, and you're looking at that page from the manuscript in Corpus Christi College, Cambridge. This is the first image known of the Wandering Jew. The man actually converted to Christianity, and he took the name Joseph. But he continued to wander the world and was supposed still to be alive in the 13th century in Armenia, patiently, if timorously, awaiting the last judgment, as Christ had warned. Joseph, bearing a hat like an eternal pilgrim, is not a conventional Jewish caricature. His bulbous nose isn't that of contemporary anti-Semitic commentary, of which we will be hearing more presently, but that of a peasant. He bears a pickaxe. That is interesting because it's the attribute, looking at the left-hand image, of Cain in many a Christian illuminated manuscript made in England, as in this 13th century illuminated page from the story of Genesis from an English Psalter, which shows Cain being reproved by God. For in Genesis, book 4, chapter 12, chapter 4, verse 12, rather, Cain himself is cursed to wander the earth and to be a fugitive. When Matthew Paris's little picture was added to the chronicle around 1240, signs that things were to turn decisively against the English Jews actually in England were only just emerging. After the Norman conquest in the year 1066, had dragged England, kicking and screaming, into Europe, the Jewish communities who subsequently entered England bore little or no relation to the hunched wanderer on Matthew Paris's page. Coming mostly from northern France and comparatively affluent, they would have been perceived by the native population as an upper class, urban citizenry in virtue simply of speaking French, the language by then of rulership. This new, posh, French-speaking community had commercial links in the conqueror's domains either side of the Channel, as this map shows. Notably Rouen. I think you can probably just see my little pointer there. The ducal seat in Normandy. In comparison with the catastrophic takeover of the country's government and affairs and the total elimination of its ruling class, the introduction of a community of newcomers wasn't, in fact, in proportion all that serious. Indeed, the Jewish population spread in the course of the next century to all England's major urban centres and, rightly or wrongly, but certainly revealingly, to this day, find carved stone structures in the Norman or Romanesque style of the later 12th century, developed in France, appear in cities such as Lincoln, Bury St Edmunds, and Norwich, and are identified with Jewish patronage. We'll be looking at those in a moment. These weren't peasants, to be sure, but an international, affluent, and cultivated community. Never numbering more than a few thousand in the course of the next 2 centuries or so, but there's a bit of debate about the numbers, certainly vastly fewer than the Jewish population of, say, medieval France. The English Jews became, in effect, protégés of the crown directly under royal protection. That point has to be made several times in the light of what's to follow. This conferred advantages in terms of some liberties, but ultimately the pact with public power was to be disastrous, as the Jews encountered a force well known in English politics and culture, the mighty and grasping power of the generally unpopular English kings over the institutional life of the country, which was to bore fruit in a very different way 500 years later when the crown dissolved the monasteries, including mighty and ancient St Albans, where Matthew Paris had written his chronicle, stripped their assets, and consigned their religion to oblivion. The monasteries had failed and were milked. The Jews of England, too, it appears, had failed commercially in the course of the 13th century, and it was this failure above all, though not solely, that led to their expulsion from England by Edward I in the year 1290. What are we to make of this tale of success, tensions, and failures? And what are we to make of its relation to the culture of medieval England and its visual and material culture particularly? Well, as I've said, key to the success and ultimately the failure of the Jewish population was this relationship with public power, the church, but more importantly, the crown. In the course of the century after their arrival in the late 11th century, the key development had been the extension of royal protection, particularly beginning in the reign of Henry I at the start of the 12th century. It should be recalled that one of the things that made England as a newly united kingdom attractive to the Norman conquerors, who simply stole it, was not just its wealth, but the high degree of its administrative coherence. England was very closely and tightly governed, and this gave the crown powers not enjoyed in other nation states. The relative weakness, for example, of the French monarchy at this time is reflected in the fact that the major schools could settle in Paris, near the court in France. In England, the universities developed well away from court and administrative centres because the king interfered, he meddled. As has often been pointed out, the English crown was never popular in the way the French monarchy was. So, in effect, the Jews became wards of the king directly under the crown's protection, and this extended to them favorable exemptions and privileges, which may, of course, have fostered resentment. The rapid spread of the Jewish population, never numbering more than a few thousand, to the main urban population centers was key to this, for the simple reason that as some subsequent magnates found out when they attempted to banish the Jewish population from some cities, Jewish people couldn't be forced out of the cities onto the land. That policy was begun in the 13th century and it failed dismally. By the later 12th century, About 25 towns or cities, such as York in the north, Lincoln in kind of in the middle, Norwich and Oxford, not only had significant populations, but were also designated for administrative purposes as archae. There's a map of the archa locations there on the left-hand screen. It's slightly blurry, I'm afraid, but that's where they were. They were in the major population centers. These were centers of Jewish record keeping, essentially. These archae were to be fatally implicated a century later when their holdings, which included notices particularly of Jewish debts to the crown, were systematically raided by King Edward I. The Jews by now were far from being wanderers, and that ultimately made them vulnerable. In the course of the next 2 centuries of the Jewish presence in England, the activities of a trading community gradually shrunk to the much more vulnerable, because morally questionable, activity of lending money at interest, or usury. In this activity, they were far from alone, because, of course, the church took a generally negative view of usury done by anybody. For example, money lending by French cohorcine moneylenders and later Italian bankers could be involved in that particular story. Our friend Matthew Paris, in his great chronicle, illustrates what he called the plague of cohorcine French Gentile usurers with a set of money bags here in the border. You see, he's spelt out in red there, the cohorcines. Still, an urban presence meant the construction of houses and shops, which brings us to an aspect of the material culture of English medieval Jews, which poses problems, while reminding us of their links to northern France. And we need to begin there, because I think it's important to see that the Jews are a substantial material presence in England, though how substantial is debatable. And this is the tradition that important surviving 12th century houses in such cities as Bury St Edmunds, Lincoln, and Norwich were built by and for wealthy Jewish citizens in the style of stonework called in England Norman, or in Europe Romanesque. This picks up my point that the Jews were in the first instances of members of the upper social echelons. Well, it has to be said straight away that unfortunately the link of houses now known as houses owned by Jews, and typically dating to the 1st century or so after the conquest, is largely a myth, typically concocted from the 17th century onwards. That's to say, the period of the return of the Jews affected by Oliver Cromwell, and during the period of a Jewish emancipation in the 19th century. 3 instances stand out, and one of them is, I think, somewhat more important. The first structure, which is on the left now, is called Moses Hall. It's on the market square in Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk, a town planned around a giant abbey church and home of St Edmund the Martyr. In fact, as Lippmann points out in his History of the Jews of Norwich, this association only dates to the post-Cromwellian period and is rendered tricky, oddly enough, because Moise, or Moses, is also a Suffolk name. I haven't checked the veracity of that, but that's the claim. There's no doubt about the fundamental date of this structure on the left-hand side, which retains the simple mouldings and round-headed windows here on the first floor of Romanesque architecture. It's a very fine, stone-dressed, expensive building. And it should be said that the fact that we can't prove that it was owned by Jews doesn't mean that it wasn't owned by Jews. There's simply a gap in the evidence. And the same attaches to the house known as Aaron's House in Lincoln, on the right-hand side, a cathedral city built very much showcasing the style of elaborate stone carving that we see, for example, if I could just go on to the next slide. Yeah, here's a detail of it as it is today, one of the arches. And this is Lincoln Cathedral. You get the same masons working on the churches and on houses that are attributed to the Jews. Now, I mentioned Aaron's house here on the right-hand side. He's an important figure in this story because he was extraordinarily wealthy. So wealthy indeed that a special exchequer had to be established to deal with his post-mortem estate. Like a unit of government had to be kind of set up to deal with it. And this set the precedent for the so-called Exchequer of the Jews, a department of the National Royal Exchequer at Westminster in London, the new administrative capital of England, of which more in a moment. The first recorded mention of the exchequer is in the year 1200, a little bit after this house was built, when 4 justices of the Jews were named, 2 of them being Jews, Benedict de Talamunt and Joseph Aaron. These justices had the status of barons of the exchequer, so these were pretty significant officers, and they were under the treasurer and chief justice of the nation. Again, unfortunately, this house was identified with Aaron only in 1878. We can't say it wasn't built by or for the Jewish residents of Lincoln. We just don't know. However, going to Norwich, there is a third case, which is sufficiently well documented to allow us to say with some confidence that this was indeed a 12th century Jewish stone house. Jernet's house, here reconstructed on the left-hand side, in Norwich, erected, interestingly, not in the main Jewish quarter, which was in the center of the city, but in the docks, in the trading area, which was at the center of a pretty significant international community of traders. I mean, Norwich was an important port, and it was the second city of England at that particular time. This house, which now consists principally on the right-hand side of a mighty stone vaulted undercroft, was raised again by masons from the cathedral priory. So you get a community, if you could afford the Christian Gentile masons, they came and built your house for you, dating to the 1170s or so. And as you can see from the left-hand picture, it's a big property, and the basic frame of it is still there. It can be shown to have been owned throughout the later 12th and 13th centuries by the well-documented Jernet family, first Isaac, then Moses, and then Abraham. Well, it is to this family in Norwich that is attached the earliest and nastiest example of anti-Semitic imagery in medieval England. Towards the end of his life, Isaac, in 1233, became the victim of a complaint logged by the Westminster Exchequer of the Jews that had descended from the administration of Aaron of Lincoln's estate. The complaint was logged by a Gentile, a man called Peter de Nerford, who had been physically injured by Isaac's henchmen in some business squabble or another, we don't quite know, presumably an attempt to recover property from Peter, noting that Isaac's henchmen were all Christians. The surviving 1233 Exchequer issue roll, and here's the top of it with a sort of point, sort of gable-like end to it, has at its head what is in effect a cartoon, you can call it what you like, a marginalium, of the type done by Matthew Paris, only appreciably cruder. It reminds us, I think, of something more broadly true. The marginal images of this type, which became common in books of all types in England in the 12th and 13th centuries, are first of all found in the products of bureaucracies, the papal chancery, and records of the type copied out by, if you imagine, gangs of bored young men who can write Latin, having to copy out, I mean, essentially tedious work that precipitates out a kind of blokish but not very attractive humor. Well, that's another story, but what I want to emphasize is that this drawing reflects a mindset not in Norwich, though that may also, of course, have been true, but at the very heart of the London administration in the reign of King Henry III, and it's Kings Henry III and Edward I that kind of culminate this story, as we will see. Anyway, I want to look a little bit more closely at this image. What is striking about it, I think, and this is, I think, quite an important point, is that it's the first instance, and one of the rarest instances, where specific Jewish individuals were targeted rather than the entire group, because we know from other documents who these people were. Well, at the head, I'll just take you through it, at the head of the image is a three-headed representation of Isaac of Norwich himself, with a crown on the top, and we'll look at a detail in a moment, but it says Isaac de Norwich there. Below, over here, is Isaac's Jewish agent and debt collector, Moshe Mocker, wearing the well-known Jewish hat, or Pileum cornutum. It's got a sort of horn on it. And that ties into all sorts of interesting problems about the horned imagery of Moses at this time, and so on. So it's quite kind of referentially rich. Opposite him is a fashionably attired lady with a sort of pillbox hat and a wimple. She's well dressed. Perhaps Mosse Mokka's wife, and she's called Avagay or Abigail. In between, a horned demon, note the horns, called Kolbif, there we are, points to their noses with zero subtlety, the noses which echo in form those of the demons that inhabit the structure just to the right. Well, here's a detail of it. I'm afraid it's slightly it's not very clear, but Isaac de Norwich, and here is Abigail there. The obvious reference here, as Sarah Lipton points out, quite rightly, is to the three-headed iconography of Antichrist as depicted at the same time in contemporary French iconography. This is from a Parisian book of about the same period, 1220s, 1230s, showing Antichrist as a three-headed crowned figure in one of the Bibles moralisées, or so-called moralized Bibles, made in the circle of the royal court of France at that time. So this is a kind of common point of reference. Well, Mosse and Abigail are depicted as residents of a fine stone structure with traceried windows and crenellations like a castle. Here signals it out as a fortified or defensive building. Whether it's lordly, aristocratic, or whether it's a city structure is hard to say. But the crenellations signify social pretension, to be sure. The structure is inhabited by the demons in the turrets and ramparts, blowing their horns as warnings. An attribute of hell. You can see the little man with a horn here. I don't know. I've got a panel of the audience here, so I don't know if you can all see this or whether it's blotted out, but I got a little picture from an alabaster here showing the harrowing of hell, and there's a picture of a little demon with a sort of horn going like that. So that's the kind of representation of the hellish afterlife. And there's a little bit of question mark as to what this picture is actually showing. To the lower left, down here, is a man with a little devil behind him with a sort of forked tongue, an arrow tongue, hooded and holding up scales, weighed with coins. Perhaps not a Jew, but one of Isaac's Christian debt collectors mentioned in the Exchequer record. Pretty clearly, as with much blokish clerical humour, there is some sort of in-joke involved in this picture, which now eludes us. But we know from another Westminster record that Mosse Mokka was referred to as Mosse cum naso, as it were, Mosse with the big nose. Or this was, of course, not unknown in the ancient world. The poet Martial, writing in the Roman era, mentioned a man called Tongilianus, who nil praeter nasum Tongilianus habet. He was all nose, but what they meant by that was that he was sort of snooty, and that it was a reference to being upper class. Now that might mean this here too, but I think this is different. The Exchequer picture isn't about class or snootiness at first sight. It's about the physiognomy of race, I think, pretty clearly. Well, in her admirably balanced book, Dark Mirror, The Medieval Origins of Anti-Jewish Iconography, my esteemed colleague Sarah Lipton suggests that this image does not promote an argument about straightforward Jewish perfidy, and that the building here is indeed the Exchequer at Westminster itself. I must confess I'm a little bit less sure about this. The expensive-looking curtaining at the bottom here is a courtly thing and was very much a fixture of palaces of the period. It indicates upper class buildings. So there we are, perhaps back to class. Class hierarchy isn't absent from this picture. The structure would be consistent with the stone-built domestic buildings I've already referred to as a status marker. The castle-like appearance suggests defensiveness or aggression, but it might also have been a reminder that as royal wards, the Jews had had physical protection in royal castles as a privilege. Didn't always work out for them, but nevertheless, all this might instill resentment and negative comment. Surely, I suggest that this is Mosse's domain and not the Exchequer. Otherwise, the Exchequer clerks would be in some way insinuating, rather improbably, that their own workplace was a nest of demons, a version of hell itself. And in some ways, the image cross refers to Christian imagery of the Last Judgment, with Isaac prevailing as a kind of antichrist, where Christ ought to be. The scales that are used to weigh the souls in Last Judgment representations now being used to weigh money, and the demonic trumpets and going on referring to the last trump of the Last Judgment, and so on. Even the tympanum-like shape of the whole thing could suggest a portal or doorway. But my point is that, complex as these images are, and it's quite proper to debate them and how they work, it strikes me that this image is, to my mind, reasonably designated as an anti-Semitic image. But by that remark about imagery more generally, I refer to the lively Jewish-Christian debate and exchange about theology. We must mention this, a huge subject which I can only touch on today, but which matters because it sets a context for later developments, particularly the use of the Christian and Hebrew Bibles. There was a lively, high-minded debate at the level of theological exchange, which at times pointed up the trivial attitude of the crown. William Rufus, William the Conqueror's son in the late 11th century, by no means hostile to the Jews, actually stated of a Jewish-Christian debate at the time that if the Jews won the argument, he would convert to Judaism. One of the next kings along, King John, threatened to do exactly the same with Islam. If the Muslims made better arguments, he would convert to Islam. No, in general, in England, the language of debate was far less mischievous, and indeed focused on the centralities of Christian belief itself. The most well-known commentator, Gilbert Crispin, who died in 1117, who was abbot of Westminster, in his Disputatio Judaei et Christiani, the dispute of Jews and Christians, acknowledged the skill of his Jewish interlocutors in our law and literature. So there was a high as well as a low-minded anti-Semitism. Such an idea could not easily be set aside. The difficulties, for example, of the central Christian image of salvation, the cross. English images that reflect stances towards the Jews in regard to the Christian Gospels are not, in fact, very common, but they lasted into the 13th and 14th century, as here. This is a little detail from a psalter called the Hoof Psalter, English work of about 1270, whose crucifixion scene depicts the hooked noses and choleric-looking mockers at the foot of the cross here above. The change of complexion here is very interesting, and also the use of the profile, which to Meyer Shapiro and other commentators on the sort of semiotics of representation in the Middle Ages always indicated a bad presence if you're shown in profile like that. You can see the same imagery is developed much later on by Hieronymus Bosch in his picture of the carrying of the cross 2 centuries later. You get the same sort of tropes, but they've emerged very early and they're being practiced already in the 13th century. A tamer instance, but one in a way that, and I won't spend much time on this one, but just to say that there are illustrations of the Gospels assembled in the early 12th century at places like Bury St. Edmunds. Here's an example, a set of Gospel pictures showing the flagellation of Christ and his carrying of the cross. We saw that earlier at Matthew Paris, and then the crucifixion, which routinely, because it was a sort of textual requirement, show Jews pointing and mocking at Christ as he goes along. They have hats that look a bit like mitres there, but nonetheless, those are the Jews who are pointing at the cross or at Christ and reproaching him. That fine gospel sequence raises the spectre of one false friend in this whole problem, the spectacular and obviously highly elite ivory cross, now in the Cloisters Museum in New York, which came on the market after World War II, and which was purchased by Thomas Hoving for the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Hoving very quickly associated the cross with Bury St. Edmunds, which we've already encountered, because he thought that its numerous inscriptions, it's absolutely covered in lettering and verse inscriptions of quite a sophisticated Latin order, were also known at Bury St. Edmunds Abbey. On the right-hand side is a detail, a medallion with a dense textual and pictorial commentary on the cross, as foreshadowed by Moses raising the brazen serpent. And here is the brazen serpent being lifted up, which is a typological anticipation, of course, of the crucifixion itself. And around him are apostles and prophets holding scrolls. It's very wordy. It's very sort of typical of the 12th century. There's a lot of lettering on it, and there is this sense, as with the disputations between the Christians and the Jews, that this is a disputatious representation. Note also the Jewish hats here with their little points. Thomas Hoving described this imagery as a diatribe against the cross with an embittered anti-Jewish message. But in recent years, a problem has emerged for what became known as the Bury St. Edmund's cross. Scholars no longer accept that it's even English, even if the typological comparisons between the Hebrew and the Bible and the Gospels reflect Jewish-Christian debate. A sense of context evaporates entirely. What does remain true is that the link between the cross as a sensitive barometer of attitudes and two specific things. The first is the close link in England, as in Europe, between violent anti-Jewish behavior and the Crusades, and the blood libel against the Jews in respect of Christian salvation. We recall that violent pogroms had erupted in Germany in the wake of the preaching of the First Crusade in 1095. In England in 1190, particularly violent movements against the Jews, most murderously in York, where the castle proved no defense at all for the poor Jews, followed from Richard I's pursuit of the crusade. In comparison, mere imagery was more reticent. Representation was not the prime domain of something that was either intellectual or violently social. Second, between the mid-12th and 13th centuries in England, whenever a Christian child died accidentally or in some uncertain manner, the Jews could be and were accused, as in Bury St. Edmunds in 1181, Bristol 1183, Winchester 1192, London 1244, and Lincoln in 1255. It's quite a list of this, resulting in massacres. The blood libel, which began in England, it seems, eventually spread to more than 150 other juries from the Rhineland to the Middle East, with a great loss of Jewish life each time. Well, one such child murder in England of a boy apprentice named William occurred in Norwich, one of the centres we've looked at, in 1144, at Easter, significantly enough. William, it was maintained, had undergone a crucifixion at the hands of the Jews of Norwich, as retold by somebody called Thomas of Monmouth, writing from Norwich Priory. A little bit, I call it suspicious, is probably not unfair. The source, perhaps, of the desire on the Priory's part to acquire a saint. They didn't have a saint, rather unusually. Well, poor William, bearing the wounds of crucifixion and thought to be a victim of human sacrifice, was found in local woods. And here are the woods where he was thought to have been found. They're still there. He was buried in the Priory and he was never canonized. His cult actually failed. The whole thing was obviously, however, it must be said, a stitch-up, like the murder in 1255 of a boy called Hugh in Lincoln, as reported by Matthew Paris, our friend, in extremely unattractive terms. At the risk of anachronism, I'm struck by the way hostile attitudes to immigrant groups coalesce around perceived or actual harm to children. For only last summer in England, spectacular riots broke out in the wake of 3 children murdered by someone taken to be a Muslim migrant, quite incorrectly, to the UK. In this case, the state acted quickly in return. So that is anachronistic, but it is interesting that children do seem to spark particular reactions of this type. Still. Well, in Hugh's case, in Lincoln in 1255, in contrast, the cult had royal support, which lasted into the 1290s, when a shrine for him was provided in the cathedral by the crown. Since the Jews were under royal protection, their position was inherently precarious, and the difficulties only increased in the course of the 13th century, in the reign of Henry III, 1216 to 1272, and his son, 1272 to 1307. Despite this, the church at large had considered the murder and mayhem in York to be reprehensible. The church didn't always come out against the Jews, though it was going to increasingly so from now on. Though the Lateran Council of 1179 had warned Christians not to associate with Jews. Nevertheless, the church maintained officially that the life and property of Jews were to be respected and in no way rescinded by the church. But the semiotics of Judaism, in England particularly, were changed following the Fourth Council, Ecumenical Council, the sort of grand get-together of the Catholic Church, held in the Lateran Palace in Rome by Pope Innocent III in 1215. That's one of these foundation moments in the narrative of the Middle Ages, of the construction, as Michel Foucault would put it, of truth. Well, the council produced canons or legally binding resolutions, which were to be applied across the whole of Christendom in a massive act of standardization of belief and values. Canons 67 to 70 here, just for a little bit of hard medieval data, are the statements translated into English. The charge against excessive usury was reinforced in order to prevent damnable mixing of people. Jews were now to be identified by dress. They were not to hold public offices. Converts to Christianity could not retain their old rights. Under the practices of the ecumenical, the total church, all these canons, these recommendations, precepts had to be passed into local law. And this was done in England at a council convened in Oxford in 1222. And this even went even further. It stiffened the provisions even further. Jews were not to retain Christian slaves, a provision which might have surfaced with Isaac Jernit's Gentile henchman in Norwich. Remember, if you were employing people, if you were employing Gentiles, that might be problematical. No new synagogues were to be built. And to prevent social mixing, the Lateran stipulation about dress and appearance in public sharpened into the requirement to wear linen badges on their breast about a palm's height. And so the Jews were to be identified either as individuals or more usually as symbolic types, as here in the case of the caricature in one of the Essex forest rolls on the left-hand side. That's quite a well-known drawing of a man called Isaac of Colchester, shown again in profile. Notice you can see Aaron of Colchester. I mean, there we are. He's called Aaron, son of the devil, Filius Diaboli, there, shown in profile. And you can see the little badge, or actually not so little badge, on his breast. This is a chronicle from Rochester of the late 13th century about the expulsion of the Jews, which I'm going to come on to in the final part of my talk, showing the badge wearers there. And this is a figure of synagogue at Lincoln Cathedral, supported by a male Jewish figure who has, you can't quite see it there, but he has the little tablets of the law badge on his bosom there. Well, in the course of the reign of Henry III, here he is, and his son, top-down cultural repression coincided with economic collapse and increasing royal demands for taxation, as Henry III increased tax burden generally. In 1232, in response to Canon 70 of the Lateran Council, preventing converted Jews from reneging on their rights, Henry instituted in London an institution called the Domus Conversorum, the House of the Converts, a house for Jews that had converted to Christianity, who were rewarded with low wages and who in turn forfeited their possessions to the crown. After the expulsion of the Jews from England in 1290, the only Jews who remained in England were converts. Matthew Paris here provides a schematic sketch of the Domus Conversorum in his great chronicle. But Henry also had ways of placing Jews under pressure, which benefited his own establishment. His most beloved project, after all, at Westminster, not just over the road from the Exchequer, was the reconstruction of Westminster Abbey in French style from 1245. 5 years later, a chalice or cup was forced out of the possession of a well-known member of the London Jewish community, Elias l'Evêque. The chalice was handed over to a man called John the Frenchman to be decorated and then given in turn to Westminster Abbey. Elias l'Evêque had been appointed by Henry III as Presbyter Judaeorum in 1243 and was repeatedly pressed by the crown for exactions. The sums were so huge, indeed, that Elias tried in effect to banish himself from the country because he couldn't cope with it, but was refused. So the chalice was not an harmonious act of interfaith cooperation, but an exaction. And this brings my brief narrative to the expulsion itself, because as is well known, Edward I's act of expulsion, enacted in the summer of autumn of 1290, was the first permanent banishment from an entire nation of its kind. At a stroke, a problem was solved, so to speak. The causes of this much discussed event can't be gone into here, but since the Church's Council of Lyon in 1274 had issued a further clampdown on usury, the pressure had mounted, in effect draining away the economic power and independence of the English Jews. Well, the English were always and always were and still are, it seems to me, an obedient nation. In 1275, in the wake of the Council of Lyon, Edward I enacted a statute de Judaismo, which explicitly forbade Jews lending and interest. The presence of Italian bankers was encouraged. They could take over the role of money lending. Attempts to force the Jews out of the cities into laboring work failed. The Jews could not be socially and economically emancipated. Prohibition of usury was in the system. And so a third option presented itself, which was, as Cecil Roth said in his great History of the Jews in England, to sweep away the problem. The actual policy of banishment had existed in theory for a long time, and local expulsions from cities like Leicester and Worcester had already started under the authority of the Crown and its relatives in the 1260s. Many factors were implicated in the calculation to banish, not least the activities and attitudes of the then Queen. Here she is. This is her effigy in Westminster Abbey on the left-hand side, Eleanor of Castile, who died in 1290, and also the Queen Mother, Henry III's mother, Eleanor of Provence. Emily Rose, who has done very interesting work on this, has looked particularly at the activities of the two Eleanors in regard to the expulsion. Queen Eleanor of Castile, who died in 1290, just as the expulsion deadline came up, gave the synagogue at Canterbury to her dressmaker before she died. But the pretext, the smoking gun, so to speak, was ultimately the catastrophic fall in tax revenue from the Jews, from sums of around 3,000 in the later 12th century to about £700 or so, a fraction of royal revenues by late 13th century standards. Indeed, Edward had prepared the way by expelling the Jews from the English possessions in France, from Gascony, and eventually was followed by Philip IV of France, who in 1306, I think, expelled the Jews from France in their entirety. That they numbered not 2,000 or 3,000, but 100,000. So that was pretty catastrophic, though not as catastrophic as the expulsions from Spain in the 15th century. Well, the final part of my talk, I'm going to sort of start winding up, but I want to set some of this in context because it's a huge topic, but to me a fascinating one. And there is a surprise in the way. If you want to get at the mindset of a king, Edward I, who's doing this, it's a good idea to look at what he has in his bedroom. Let me explain. The symbolics of all this were extraordinary. The formal act of the Council of Edward I, which implemented the expulsion of the Jews in 1290, was taken on July the 18th, the feast of the 9th of Av, the anniversary of the manifold disasters of the Jewish people, and an occasion for mourning and fasting commemoration, commemorating especially the fall of the temple under Nebuchadnezzar, a fact that was noted with awe by Jewish chronicles, but which I suggest was entirely characteristic of Edward I. And the deadline was the 1st of November 1290. Jews were allowed to leave England with money and possessions, but their debts, their homes, their buildings, including synagogues and cemeteries, were forfeit to the king. In effect, the 2,000 to 3,000 Jews affected were nationalized and removed, an act of cultural and economic intervention by the state, which, as I've said, reminds us of the powers of the temporal governments in England at this time, and which plagued England throughout the Middle Ages. Well, histories of the expulsion, indeed, looking at this slide of Conway Castle, or Harlech Castle, I should say, rather, in Wales, tend to pass over Edward's imperial policy at large. And I do think the expulsion of the Jews, these big gestures, need to be placed in the context of what the kings of England were up to. Because after all, Edward was the conqueror of Wales. He was the conqueror of Scotland. He was forging a British sensibility. To do this, he took emblems of Wales and Scotland, relics, other items of ritual from these subordinate or subject territories, such as the Stone of Scone or the Stone of Destiny, which was put in a special throne by Edward I. It was taken from the Abbey of Scone in Scotland in 1296 and given to Westminster Abbey. Westminster's becoming the idea of the sort of administrative symbolic centre of the countryside. Edward was a large-scale planner. He was a man of empire, and he invented a whole ritual language that survives in the coronation to this day. The latest coronation with King Charles sitting in exactly the throne that was made for the Stone of Scone, which was brought down from Edinburgh, especially for the purpose. A large-scale planner, but Edward was a researcher. He saw the importance of history and precedent. By appropriating Welsh and Scottish symbols, he was neutralizing their function for those people. Just as the expulsion order of the Jews went ahead, it was timed according, as we've said, to the Jewish ritual year, not that of the royal administration. That, I think, is a typical Edwardian gesture. There's real thought behind it, albeit of an unpleasant type. Edward thought ahead. A few weeks earlier, he had secretly commanded the sealing of the many archae that we've encountered, which contained records of Jewish debts, which in effect immediately became frozen national assets. The archae and the exchequer of the Jews had been set up precisely to protect records that could be and were burnt by anti-Jewish mobs. Now the law of unintended consequences came into effect. Official protection became plundering. Well, there's an astonishing example of this appropriative thinking big in the way that Edward I decorated his state bedroom or state chamber in the Palace of Westminster in exactly these years. This is a little known fact, but it does, I think, shed light on him. From April 1292, 18 months after the expulsion, Edward's wall painters executed an extraordinary program of paintings in his bedchamber in the heart of the Palace of Westminster. This is where the Houses of Parliament are now. The whole thing went up in smoke in 1834, but it was copied. So we have drawings of these wall paintings, and they are, I think, not uninteresting and not irrelevant to the question of, as it were, the formation of attitudes towards the Hebrew Bible and the Jews, particularly. Well, here's a view of the picture of the painted chamber in the early 1800s, and this was the House. This was the House of Parliament. This is worth bearing in mind. These rooms were the home of the Mother of Parliaments. Around this room were a series of narrative friezes, and I've put in the topics that we can infer in this room, all drawn from the Hebrew Bible, and from particularly the books of Maccabees, the books of Kings, and Judges, a spectacular series of narratives of heroes like Judas Maccabeus, but appalling tyrants like Antiochus, anti-Jewish rulers like Nebuchadnezzar, Sennacherib, Pharaoh, royal psychopaths drawn from the rulers of Judah like Abimelech and Saul, tyrants, madmen, all doomed, as the theory of tyrannicide of the time permitted, to ridiculous ends, all cursed and then humiliated. Such is the end of power. Well, as is well known to anybody who studies state symbolism, much in royal iconography was drawn ultimately from the Hebrew Bible. As anyone who watched the coronation ceremony at Westminster Abbey will know, Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anointed Solomon king. It was a commonplace of medieval kingship that it modeled itself on exemplars from the Bible. A successful king like Edward I should have surpassed such models, not surprisingly. In the painted chamber in the Palace of Westminster that we're looking at, Edward was in effect likened to Judas Maccabeus. Here's the warfare of Judas Maccabeus. This is a 19th century copy, but this picture was pretty big. It was 10 feet high and glittered with gold and silver. And you could see Judas Maccabeus is identified by an inscription there. In eulogies after his death, Edward was held to have surpassed Pharaoh, because just as Pharaoh was swallowed by the Red Sea, so Edward had expelled the Jews and other unbelievers from England. The historical morality here is, of course, Christian, stemming ultimately from St. Augustine. This was a Christian spectacle, not the familiar vision of the Jews in the Gospels reproaching or mocking Christ, but a much more literal, appropriative, and I think ambivalent vision of the disasters of the Bible. How explicitly anti-Semitic these images were is a matter for discussion. The question, I think, is connotation, implication, because many of the pictures were thoroughly nasty. For example, one scene included pictures from the Book of Kings, fourth Book of Kings, of the famine in Samaria caused by the Aramaeans, in which the children are cut up and eaten by the poor Samaritans. The painted chamber, the king's chamber, was used as a feasting chamber. You can see that going on here. A lot of the picture had fallen away, but you can see there's a happy table there of feasting figures and then unfortunate acts of cannibalism. From the second book of Maccabees, the wicked king Antiochus forces a man called Eleazar. This was happening over here. There's a good early 19th century description of this. He forces Eleazar to eat pork this force feeding. He rips out the tongues of the Maccabean martyrs here, who are then boiled in oil, effectively. In the book of Judges, Abimelech strews salt on the ground, murders his brothers here with a sort of scimitar, and is finally humiliated, having set fire to a castle, by a millstone being dropped on his head by a woman. This is, of course, a sort of shocking humiliation for him, and he begs to be dispatched by his squire and so on. He's a nasty piece of work. And then, perhaps most directly, Nebuchadnezzar sacks the temple, precisely the event commemorated on the 9th of Av, but here as if in an act of supreme hypocrisy, in such a way as to suggest Edward I's moral superiority. Here we can see at the top Nebuzaradan, who is Nebuchadnezzar's agent in this, presiding over the whipping of the people of Jerusalem. Here they've got a flail, and here are in French it says "Les gens de Jérusalem." Here the people of Jerusalem are being taken away. And the treasures of the temple here, the Temple of Jerusalem, are carted off as the place is sacked and pillaged. What needs emphasizing is that this is the only scene of this event known to have been painted on this scale at this date in Europe. It's painted opposite the bed of Edward I, but months after the expulsion of the Jews on the 9th of Av. The coincidence with recent events is sufficiently astonishing not to be overlooked, I will submit. Well, look, I better start winding up because I don't want to go on for too much longer, and Saul will quickly hush me up if I do. But if I may just make a few final words just to tidy this up, because a whole series of observations stems from this. For a start, you need to look at these pictures quite closely. We looked at the exchequer roll about Isaac and Mosamoka quite closely. If you look at Abimelech, you'll see that his armor, the sort of surcoat that he wears, has goats' heads carved on it. Well, they could be symbolic of tragedy. I won't go into that because these stories are often known as tragedies, the downfall of rulers. But it's worth bearing in mind that Synagoga, the figure of Synagoga, occasionally wears a goat skin and wrapped around her. Here we are in Erfurt, in Thuringia, in the 1330s or so, with the wise and foolish virgins. Here are the foolish virgins grieving that they've been locked out of heaven, and Synagoga is the final one, a figure who is often exposed to ridicule in the Middle Ages, and she's wearing a goat skin. So you have to look quite closely at this imagery and quite inclusively. You see, Synagoga is often presented as a beautiful, even slightly erotic or carnal image at Bamberg here in the 1230s. At Strasbourg, probably the most famous image of Synagoga of all, Strasbourg Cathedral. That's again of about the 1230s. But we forget that enactments of the Passion that involved the figure of Synagoga, actual theatrical enactments, could and did see Synagogue as a defeated figure, not to be sympathized with in her beautiful state, as it were, but ridiculed. One such play, a late 14th century dramatic feast of the presentation of the Virgin associated with Philippe de Mézières, includes a striking passage, actually a stage instruction during the drama, in which Synagoga, facing up to the Christian truth and inclining her head to the left as if miserable, and you can see that's what Synagoga does here at Strasbourg, as if miserable, turning around and appearing to cry, is promptly expelled, weeping and wailing, from the dramatic arena arranged in the church, in such a way that it takes a while, the stage instruction says, for the audience to quieten down their laughter at her plight, despite her eloquent behavior. Her pathetic state is ridiculed, not emphasized with. Nasty laughter, contempt, and naturally hypocrisy were the stock in trade of medieval Christian thought about opposites, about the other. As Carlo Ginzburg points out, this may arise from the fundamental ambivalence, born of the fact that the Old Testament, the Bible of the Jews, and the New Testament are literally bound together in the Christian dispensation. The thesis of rejecting the old as obsolete and keeping only the new was itself rejected by Christianity. The Hebrew Bible was part of the Christian dispensation, but this was a basis for ambiguity. It implied both a continuity and a divergence up to and including Christian anti-Judaism itself. Well, I think I better stop there. I was going to go on to say a very few remarks about the routinization of um, a, a Jewish image or anti-Jewish imagery after the expulsion, when there's no longer the social reality of the Jews, except for the converts that remained in the Domus Conversorum. Um, but when the Jews become, as it were, part of an imaginary, and there's much debate about this, whether we look at Bible picture books, whether we look at representations of the funeral of the Virgin and the little Jewish boys whose hands get stuck to the catafalque of the Virgin Mary. You can see this is about 1320 in Oxfordshire, ordinary parish church painting, and they still got the same sort of noses that Moss and Mocker had a century earlier. So this is part of a sort of routine stock in trade, and even very interesting debates about the Hereford Mappa Mundi, which Deborah Strickland has talked about recently, including anti-Semitic information. But this is a big topic. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. I've done my best to cover some of it at least. Saul, I hand you back, but thank you for your time.
Thank you, Paul. We do have some time for questions and comments if people are interested in asking about any of this. There was quite a lot of it, and many possible questions come to mind for me. Um, I was, as an outsider to medieval studies, but someone who had studied in two courses as an undergrad many decades ago, I was quite struck by what I think your argument is. Edward is lying in his bed, in his bedchamber, looking up at images of um, the exiles leaving Jerusalem after the fall of Jerusalem to the Neo-Babylonian Empire.
Mm-hmm.
And he's making the connection with his own expulsion, I suppose, on the 9th of Av. This is what you're getting at. But
Yeah,
how is
well,
he,
yeah,
or have
I
I
mean,
misunderstood?
no, I think I mean, one can't, it's not what you call a hard argument. I mean, it is simply astonishing
It
that,
seems astonishing, doesn't
yeah,
it?
I mean, it is simply astonishing because you see the thing is this type of picture sequence, you get representations of the Old Testament in so-called Bible picture books. There's a very famous one which many people who study and love the 13th century in France will know, called the Morgan Bible Picture Book, and it covers the books of Genesis through to first books of Kings. So it's effectively an octateuch. What these pictures do is cut, and some of the events do. For example, Abimelech occurs in the Morgan Bible picture book. But what is interesting about the painted chamber is it bears no relation at all to standard illustrated sequences of the Hebrew Bible. These are very rare images to be seen. You won't find there aren't, there isn't, in other words, a kind of commonplace currency into which you can fit this. And when you get things that are very much out of the ordinary, you have to start suspecting that there's some other programmatic reason why they've been chosen. And in my own work, I've emphasized that there are really two. The first is that this is a narrative about tyranny and Edward I claiming not to be a tyrant, but of course, effectively in the way he treats Scotland and Wales, the way he governs England, the way he researches, because I left out of my narrative the way when he goes into Scotland, he has already ordered a ransacking of the archives, monastic archives, in support of his claim to Scotland and to Wales. In other words, these things are backed up by a detailed sense of precedent. And so when the 9th of Av is chosen by the council, it's impossible to believe it isn't coincidental. So when I first wrote about these, I wrote about these 40 years ago, and I made an observation that it was, to say the least, interesting that Edward I would have these pictures in his own bedroom. And I said I thought that it could very well be, part of the afterlife of the expulsion of the Jews. And I was trodden on comprehensively by at least one reviewer who said, no, this is completely unfair. So I concede immediately that there are people who won't follow this or won't agree with it. And yet when I come back to it, it does seem to me so extraordinary. So you do understand my argument, but I will say that it's a soft, not a hard argument. In other words, we don't know why exactly these scenes were chosen, and more that we had more documentation. But I hope I'm not putting two and two together and making 22, as art historians sometimes do.
Well, I don't know. I find this very interesting. I'll pursue this with one more question.
Yeah.
Does this suggest that Edward I sees himself as a new Nebuchadnezzar? Would you go that far?
Well, no, I don't think he could. Well, the interesting thing, Saul, your question is characteristically perceptive, because the thing about all these Old Testament types, take Pharaoh. Pharaoh is a classic model because Pharaoh can be a good exemplar or a bad exemplar, depending on who you read. He could be Edward I is better than Pharaoh because he expels the Jews, whereas Pharaoh is drowned in the Red Sea. I don't think Nebuchadnezzar was anything ever other than a poor exemplar, but Nebuchadnezzar was used by Christian kings as an example of the downfall of kings, because of course Nebuchadnezzar is the king with the feet of clay, as you know. So what I'm getting at is this thing that Carlo Ginzburg gets at, that there's always this ambivalence with this imagery. You know, it's unlikely that Edward I would have called himself a new Nebuchadnezzar. That was an unheard of act, would have been an unheard of act. No, the claim would be he was untyrannical, and that this was in a way of, how can I say, glossing over what he himself had done. So it's not a straightforward argument. And I would leave it at that. I think there is an interesting ambivalence, but I just think these things should be talked about.
I'd like to thank you very, very much, Paul, um, for this presentation from which I know I learned an awful lot. I always learn a lot from you, I should say, um, and have been for many decades. So, um, again, thank you very much. We really appreciate your willingness to be our guest tonight and to join us for this endowed lecture.
My pleasure. Thank you very much indeed. It was a great honor to speak to you all on a huge subject. To deal with this in 40 minutes in any way is of course impossible. But anyway, I just thought we'd touch on a few issues. So thank you very much, Saul, for your kind words. I appreciate it.